one of you for your desire to clarify the discussion. However, we think that you have gone astray in some of these responses that you've had that just misapprehended the nature of this act. Firstly, I want to address this concept this caveat that we've given, that the corporation would be morally obligated to its stockholders or its shareholders to create an app based on its profitability. This is not sufficient grounds for them to be corporately responsible, in other words, morally obligated. As you yourself explicated, there has to be a corresponding right to give them a moral obligation. And secondly, it is not clear whether or not Microsoft's app itself would produce gigantic profits. The reason we didn't bring up profitability is because that's not a moral consideration in the appropriateness of this app. Whether or not it would bring up massive profits is seriously questionable, just as we've said, because there are many, many apps that have similar technology. And as a matter of fact, this patent hasn't been followed through on since 2007 for precisely that reason. Now, I want to move on then to what was mentioned later in the presentation, that if this app needs to be updated, and we need to consider the possibility that, God forbid, Microsoft as a company could go under and Windows 8 just doesn't work, or whatever the case may be. It just doesn't happen. And so then this app would be out of date and then unethical. Firstly, as unlikely as that seems, we acknowledge that, but would like to point out the fact that the application world, in the technological world at this point, is naturally self-selecting. If an application represents inaccurate data, it simply ceases to be used, particularly if it belongs to a company that no longer exists and is no longer updated. That'll pass to Chris.
To jump in on that point, the app could easily be made such that it's merely refreshing and taking in the published crime statistics from another source. So the app wouldn't need to be, for example, you create an app that's always fetching the current crime statistics data from the public repository without having it inside the app itself. So you wouldn't need to update the app that way.
Now, to address briefly this comment about the reference to a guidebook being ethically irrelevant, but the guidebook itself might contain some kind of deep harm, and that referencing it doesn't alone prove the point. I acknowledge, if we want to question whether or not the use of guidebooks by church, that it's not sufficient proof. I was simply using it as an appeal to say that it seems so clear that it is the moral right of a pedestrian to use a guidebook, and given that it seems very irrational to challenge that right, it also seems irrational to challenge that right. So we didn't feel it necessary to give that groundwork. With that, I'll pass it to David.
Thank you, James. And I would like to talk about 2 points in particular. One of the points was this idea that in order for Microsoft to have to make this app, you'd have to show that there's a corresponding right in people. And I would say that this seems odd, that it doesn't seem like all norms or that all goods are derived from rights in other people. For example, I might say that I really should go do my homework. That seems like a good thing to do. It seems like something I ought to do. But that seems weird. Where is there a right? Is there a right in someone else that compels me to do my homework? So it seems like there are definitely cases where there's a good that you can do, but it is not derived in a right from someone else. So we do not need to show that there's a right in the locker for security, but rather say that there's a good if they did provide for that security, for that safety. And secondly, I would like to talk about the idea that if it is good, then they are obligated. This doesn't seem to follow necessarily, that especially if in the case that there are other apps out there. For example, Chris or myself have programmed before, and perhaps we could come up with a similar app. It doesn't seem like we're morally obligated to do so, especially since there are other apps already out there. It seems an odd consequence. And with that, that's James.
And then to address the point on transparency of sources, that this app would become unethical if they weren't transparent with the sources that we use. As we detailed in our initial presentation,